We're in John chapter 4, verses 1 through 42. And I want to talk about what is the gospel, or who is the gospel for part 2. Last week was part 1. So basically, if you haven't been here in a while, what we're doing is a whirlwind tour of Jesus. 5 key passages that shed light on who Jesus is and what he is about. In other words, every time you read something about Jesus, you should have these passages in your mind to frame and contextualize everything else you're reading. So last week was Nicodemus, John chapter 3, where Jesus basically says, you've got to be born twice. And this week, it's the passage right after that, the woman at the well in John chapter 4, and here's somebody who actually is born twice. She becomes a brand new person by the end of this passage. And that's what I want to look at. This passage is basically John's version of the prodigal son story. You ever thought about that? Think about this. There is a daughter, not a son, who is wayward. Now, I know the text doesn't call her a daughter. The text just describes her as a woman. We don't even get her name, but every woman is somebody's daughter. You have a daughter who is wayward. You have a father who is seeking. You have a son who is hungry. See what I'm saying? You could even say you have an elder brother who's hungry. Daughter, father, son, wayward, seeking, hungry. And all of this happens on a stage. So that's kind of the outline. What I want to do is start with the stage. So first of all, this thing is happening in a context. And what I mean by that, have you guys ever seen a great movie where every single scene, every single line, every single camera angle, sometimes even the colors, all have meaning, all have significance. Everything is super tightly edited. It's just like boom, 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 boom. That's this passage. Everything in here has weight, which makes it hard to get through 42 verses. How do you do that in one session without glossing a lot of things? What I really want to try to do is show you the big picture so that you can work back through it yourself. It is very easy for us in the 21st century to miss a lot of what's happening in this passage. The first century audience, particularly Jews, would have been shocked and scandalized by almost every aspect of this passage. And so I want you to feel a little bit how shocking and scandalous this is, but in a good way. Okay? First of all, there's a couple of things that I want you to make sure you notice. Do you see how it starts? Just the connection to Nicodemus. Remember what I said earlier? This passage is meant to be, John put this right after Nicodemus on purpose. He starts it out by saying, when Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard. In other words, Jesus is like, all the Pharisees, the religious leader, of whom Nicodemus is a part. Now, Nicodemus is not, doesn't seem to have the edge against Jesus that the rest of the Pharisees do, but he's part of them. And they would have heard that he had gone and talked to Jesus and that Jesus said he was lost. And the Pharisees would have been like, how dare he? And all of their attention is now shifting from John the Baptist to Jesus. And Jesus is like, guess what? It's all focused on me now. And he's like, watch this. And what he does is he goes down through Samaria. What I want you to think is this. With Nicodemus, you've got a guy that is so put together, personally, professionally, and on the surface, spiritually. And Jesus says, no, he's blind, he's lost, he doesn't know God yet because he hasn't even been born. He hasn't even gotten started spiritually. Okay? And now the very next scene is here is a woman so lost, personally, professionally, socially, spiritually, and yet somehow by the end of the passage, she sees, She recognizes who Jesus is. Her entire life changes, and the community around her is revitalized. Do you see the difference? It's like this is like what Nicodemus, what you would hope would happen with Nicodemus. This is actually happening, and it's happening in Samaria, not in Jerusalem. Very, very significant. Now listen, let's talk about Samaria, because that's also important. Basically, if you have a map at the back of your Bible, can you guys picture in your head where Jerusalem is? Okay, north of Jerusalem is an area called Galilee, Sea of Galilee, where Jesus was raised. In between Jerusalem and Galilee, about halfway. So let's just pretend Galilee's 60 miles north. Halfway in the middle, there's a region called Samaria. Okay, this is essentially, if you're familiar with the prodigal son story, where the brother goes off to the far country, this is like far country to the Jews. In other words, tucked between their land, there is a group of people that are basically pagans from the Jews. Not just pagans, they're apostates. And the relationship here is actually like Jews and Muslims now. You know how Muslims originated about 600, 700 years after Jesus? Okay? Well, Samaritans originated hundreds of years after. You've got the patriarchs, you've got Moses, you've got Abraham, then you've got Moses, and then you've got basically the judges, you get to David. And what happens is after David, the king, this group of people splits off, okay, and they form kind of their own version of Judaism. And they end up getting mostly wiped out. So subsequent Jews looked on those people, and they basically see those people as if they're adulterers. They despise these people. The text actually says Jews don't have anything to do with Samaritans, and they know it. Now listen, how do you think the Samaritans felt about the Jews? It's very similar to the Islam versus Judaism stuff going on in the Middle East today. There is not a lot of love lost in both directions. Okay? But the point is, just like today, both Muslims and Jews claim Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. They've got the same forefathers. Muslims claim Jesus, guys. He's just a prophet, not a Messiah. Okay? This is the same way. Samaritans have got the same ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, but the Jews look at them as apostates. Okay? The idea that somebody like this could actually enter the kingdom, absolutely offensive. You need to abandon your Judea or your Samaritanism and become Jewish. And that doesn't happen here. Okay? So there's one more piece. Where all of this happens is in a town called Sychar, all right, which corresponds to, in the Old Testament, it's a place called Shechem. And you're like, that doesn't mean much to me. Don't worry. I'll tell you a little bit about it. But there's a reference to Sychar, there's a reference to Jacob, and there's this reference to this well. I just want to give you, if you were a Jew or a Samaritan, you've got the same Old Testament stories in Genesis about the patriarchs. And there are all sorts of allusions to the patriarchs here, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Listen, in Genesis 24, you had Abraham, whose son was Isaac. There is a scene where basically Isaac sends a servant back to the land that they came from, which would be in Mesopotamia. It's a place called Paddan Aram. There's a cousin or a nephew called Laban. And he's like, go get a wife, see if you can find a wife for me from my own people. All right? Actually, I think Abraham sends him to get a wife for Isaac. But here's the point. The servant goes in Genesis 24, and he shows up at the place where the relatives live, and there's this prayer. He's like, how do I find a wife? And he's like, oh God, of my fathers, show me the woman. And he's like, I'm going to wait at the spring, and the first woman, I'm going to find a beautiful woman. I'm going to ask her give me a drink. And not only is she going to say, give me a drink, or she's going to say, here, she's going to water my flock, my camels as well. Guess who comes down? You've got Rebecca, a beautiful virgin. It's in the evening. He says, give me a drink. Do you hear the echoes here? Okay. In Genesis 29, a few chapters later in the Old Testament, Jacob flees his brother Esau. He's stolen his birthright. He's stolen his blessing. He kind of hightails it back to, guess where? Paddan Aram. And as he's getting close, he's like, hey, what country am I in now? And there's some shepherds. And he goes down to talk to the shepherds. This is in Genesis 29. And they're like, well, you're in Paddan Aram. And he's like, oh my gosh, I've made it. And guess who comes? There's a well, and it's covered by a big storm or stone, and it's high noon. And here comes a flock, and guess who's leading the flock? There's a beautiful girl named Rachel. You know, and he's like, let's uncover the well. And the other shepherds who are sitting there, older shepherds, are like, no, we don't uncover it till the evening. It's high noon, it's hot. And you're like, why is she coming in? Maybe she's just a more efficient shepherdess. I don't know. But she's, you know, all the other guys are still chasing their sheep. She's bringing the sheep in. And so Jacob does this heroic thing, rolls the stone away by himself. And he gives not only her a drink, but he waters her animals. They end up getting married. Okay, listen. In Genesis 33, the same Jacob, they're back in the promised land. He has fled from now he's got like 2 wives, 2 concubines, and a whole herd of kids. Okay? But he buys a field in Shechem. The same place we're talking about right now that's going to eventually become Sychar. And what happens right after, he's eventually going to give that field to Joseph in Genesis chapter 48. But listen, what happens in Genesis 34, right after he's bought this field by Shechem, his daughter is raped, Dinah, by a prince of Shechem. And he's like, let me marry her. I love her, you know. And what happens is Jacob's sons slaughter the entire community, the men. After tricking him to be circumcised. But here's the point. Jacob says at the time, you've brought trouble on me, boys. And the sons say, should our daughter be treated like a prostitute? Do you hear all of the... In other words, if you grew up in Sychar, you've heard about Jacob. You've heard about Isaac. You know all about wells. And you know about beautiful women and virgins. And you also know about prostitutes and butchery. And it's all part of your backstory. And along comes... So you've got Jacob's sons. Shall our sister be treated like a prostitute? You've got Jacob's children, sons, Israel, the Pharisees. They actually treat the Samaritans like they're prostitutes. The Samaritans themselves are treating this woman like she's a prostitute. And Jesus comes and treats her like a sister and a daughter of the king. That's the context. Okay, all of this is backstory. It's context. It colors what happens. Now, look at the actual story for just a second. There's 3 parts. There's this conversation with the woman at the well about water, which is kind of weird. Then Jesus says, get your husband. That feels random. It turns into a debate about worship. Almost feels like Jesus is lecturing her at one point. And then it pivots to the Messiah, and Jesus is like, ta-da, I am he. And all of a sudden she's like, let me go get my friends. And suddenly the whole town believes and likes her. Crazy story. Okay. Do you see how strange that feels? So now let's jump in and let's look at the daughter who is wayward, the father who is seeking, the son who is hungry. And I'm just going to do this quick. If I can ever do anything quick. Okay. Daughter who is wayward. The text clearly portrays the woman as wayward. She's a social outcast. Listen, what little girls ever grow up and it's like, I want to be married to 5 different guys and then shack up with the 6th? No girl ever dreams that. serial sexual relationships. The text doesn't tell us why. There could actually be a number of reasons why. Maybe it's a really patriarchal, and I don't know that much about Samaritan culture. Maybe it's patriarchal. I don't know whether she couldn't get out of it. Okay, but here's what I do know. Listen, why is she? It's noon at the well in the center of a village, and the only two people there are the woman and Jesus. Why is that?
The women, they didn't want to be around her.
Yeah, noon is when the bad girls get to go get their water from the well, because that's when it's hot. In the morning and the evening is when all the good girls and the good people go and get their water. The fact that she's there at noon is very clear. She's a social outcast. By the end of this story, she's going to say to the people, come see the man who told me everything I've ever done. And you can imagine those people going, everything you've ever done? Like, we know all the stuff you've done. At the beginning of the story, she is actually controlled by their perception of her. By the end of the story, she's freed from it. See the movement? Okay. Here's what I know. If you sleep with enough people, if you marry enough people, even secular people, irreligious people, are going to start to raise their eyebrows and shake their heads, and at a certain point, they're going to think you're a bad girl. That's human nature. Your own friends will do the same thing. So you've got a culture of outcasts, and she's outcast from the outcasts. See that? Okay. The conversation is weird if you read it flat. And what I mean by that is if you read this like a guy going, can I have a drink? And the woman saying, you know, how is it that you, a Jew, ask for a drink from me? And then the guy says, if you knew the gift from God, you'd be asking, like, that's flat. If you read it charged, there's actually, it's like, whoa, wait just a second. I think there might be some subtext going on here. For example, if I said to you, in our culture, hey, there was a guy at a stoplight and, you know, a car pulled up, a woman was driving, and you said, hey, could I have a ride? You'd be like, feels pretty innocuous, right? If I said, it's Vegas on the Strip at midnight, and there's a priest standing on the corner, and a Corvette pulls up, a red Corvette, with a woman driving in very, you know, Vegas-y clothes, and he leans over and says, can I have a ride? Okay, do you see the difference? What I would like, what'd you say? That would be really weird. What I would like to suggest, I'm going to read this, and I'm going to read it in a charged way. I think Jesus knows who he's... in other words, Jesus is not like, oh, there's a woman at the well in the middle of the day, it's noon, I wonder who she is. He can guess. Jesus says, I'm thirsty. Can you give me a drink? Where's Marilyn? I don't know where she went. It feels really weird looking at anybody else that's not my wife saying it this way. I'm going to... Okay. Look at the text. I got to look, but you got to have the eye contact. The point is...
I think we'll get it.
You'll get it. Thanks. Okay. And the woman says, kind of shocked look, there's Marilyn. The woman says, you, a Jew, are asking me for a drink? In other words, do you know who I am? And Jesus says, you knew the gift of God, you'd be asking me for a drink. Okay, and the woman says, whoa, who do you think you are, sir, mister? Okay, are you greater than Jacob? Now listen, everything we've just said about Jacob, you're like, oh my gosh. Do you hear all the subtext all of a sudden? Are you greater than Jacob who gave us this well? Jesus says, actually, there's a problem with this water. It leaves you thirsty. All water, you get thirst. And, okay. And he says, but the water I've got satisfies forever. Do you hear how somebody could be, you could see two people at a bar talking this way and you'd be like, oh wait, they're not talking about water in a well. Okay? Now, I want to just tell you right now, if this makes some of you uncomfortable, you don't have to read it this way. You can read it flat. I also want to make it really clear, I don't think Jesus is flirting with her here or hitting on her. I think Jesus is speaking her language. This is a woman who has been in serial sexual relationships probably all of her life. She knows guys, she knows how guys talk, and Jesus is talking in a way that she actually connects with, for better or worse. Now listen, why would he be doing that? And I'm going to show you. As soon as she says, give me this water, like if you read it flat, it's like, sir, give me this water. I'm ready to become a Christian. I don't think that's what's going on. I think she's saying, okay, mister, prove it. Come on. What do you got? Show me your, where is this going? Let's find out. And Jesus immediately says, go get your husband. Now, here's what I think is going on. Some scholars are like, because they read it flat, they're like, why on earth does he talk about, why does he change the subject? She was ready to become a Christian. Okay? And I think what Jesus is actually saying is go get your man, bring him back and compare him to me. In other words, you have been dipping the bucket of your soul in the well of men, in the well of marriage, in the well of sex, in the well of relationship, whatever it is. You've had 5 guys, and the guy you're with now is not your husband. In other words, you're thirsty. You keep dipping in this well. Okay? It's not working. You've had 5 guys, and the guy you're with now is not your husband. That's how I read this passage. And if I'm right on this, it's actually all about thirst. Now, let me give you some application from this. First of all, does this make sense so far? Okay, listen. Isn't it fascinating that the Bible picks a woman that almost every person around her, both Jew and Samaritan, would say, that is a bad woman. And instead of the Bible saying that is a bad woman, the Bible says that is a thirsty woman. In other words, it doesn't go into morality based on behavior. It actually goes into motivation behind the behavior. And it's saying you have this deep, this abiding, unquenchable thirst. Okay, the question for all of us, what are you thirsting for? Like, most of us don't look in the mirror and go, am I thirsty? Most of us look in the mirror and go, I'm not a bad person. You know what I'm saying? And Jesus is going, let's forget good or bad for right now. Let's talk about thirst. What are you thirsty for? Listen, some people drink to be filled. Okay? This will make me okay. This will make me successful. This will fulfill me. This will help me know I'm not a bum. You can drink from the well of business, success, job, good looks, social followers, all sorts of things, where you're dipping your bucket in that well and you're trying to fill something. Now, you can also drink from wells to escape. Why do people get lost in alcohol? Why do people get lost in drugs? Why do people sometimes get lost in relationships and sex and stuff like that? Maybe this is the only place she's ever felt loved. We don't know. Maybe she is scared to death that she wants to be secure. Again, we don't know. There's all sorts of motivations. And she could be drinking to try to fulfill something. She could be drinking to try to escape, or not. She could be drinking from this well of men. But the point is, what well or wells are you drinking from and why? And once you start thinking about brokenness this way, okay, it really changes your outlook. This is a super important question. When you start asking it, it changes you. Okay, now the text says that Jesus says that none of the wells we drink from are going to satisfy us. They will always leave you thirsty for more. In other words, if you're drinking from the well of I'm going to be a successful career person, I'm going to make lots of money, I'm going to be beautiful. I'm going to be loved. I'm going to have a great wife. I'm going to have a great husband. He's saying all of those wells, none of those are bad things necessarily, but every single one of those wells is going to let you down and leave you thirsty. Okay? And what actually happens with this particular well, okay, guys, relationships, is every time you go back, there's a little less water, so you got to go deeper. I'm rereading a book by Mary Carr right now called Lit. Fabulous book. But she talks about dealing with alcoholism. Her own. And she's like, I got to the point where I was drinking all the time. And it was no longer giving me what it used to give me. Okay? Do you see what I'm saying? You can do the exact same thing with sex. You can do the exact same thing with work. This is the point. The text paints Jesus as the true well. This is super radical. He's the only well whose water fills you up, who quenches your thirst, who fills the hole, who satisfies your heart. His water doesn't make you thirstier. What's interesting, the text is not painting Jesus as a spiritual advisor who shows you how to improve your life. It actually shows you as the goal of your spirituality. It's to know Him. It's to be in relationship with Him. That's the well that you're drinking from. Okay. In other words, what she gets out of this, it's not like, oh, I prayed a prayer and became a Christian. She's like, I actually know this dude named Jesus now, and I'm with him. You see what I'm saying? Relationship. A whole different kind of relationship. She is with a guy that's no longer just with her because of what she can give him sexually. She's with a guy who's like, we're going to have a totally different kind of relationship. And it completely liberates her. Okay.
It also seems like he's not denying, like there's nothing wrong with her thirst, it's just the wrong source.
Yeah.
Either like, it's fine for you.
He's not going, you shouldn't be thirsty.
Yeah.
He's saying, of course you're thirsty. It's okay to want to be successful. It's okay to long for sex. It's okay not to want to be lonely. But if we go to those things and make them ultimate things, he's saying they will desert you, they will disappoint you, they will actually, it's like drinking salt water. It'll make you thirstier, and it's not, eventually you're going to throw up.
It's just like
Okay.
Jesus is like laying his own, not interpretation, but it's like that vision of the kingdom, right?
Yeah.
Like coming down. It's like I'm taking what's there and I'm rewriting it and revamping it.
Now, let's use that vision of the kingdom to transfer to the second point, the Father who is seeking. This whole middle section, as soon as he says, go get your husband, she's like, I don't have a husband. He's like, you're right, you don't have a husband. You've had 5 guys who are all your husband, and the guy you're with now is not your husband. You're exactly right. She's like, oh, fuck. That's not in the text, but I guarantee you she was thinking that. If you met a complete stranger who said that about you, you would be like, how do you know? Have you been stalking me? Okay? And clearly he hasn't because he's Jewish. You're like, no. How does he know this? And she goes, sir, I perceive you're a prophet. And the whole conversation shifts. All of a sudden it's like, oh, we're going to have I'm talking to a religious prophet now. And I fall into this like, how many of you guys know people, as soon as the word predestination comes up, ooh, all of a sudden it's like, some people say this and it's like it falls into a rut. And she starts talking about, you Jews say we got to worship up there, but we say you got to worship here. And Jesus, here's what I want to point out. He says 2 things. The first is about worship. He actually says worship is really, really, really important. Okay? In other words, most of us tend to think about worship as the musical part of what happens at a service on Sunday. And if it's really good, you'll get some feels. Jesus actually seems to look at worship, and I think he's saying the well that you are dipping the bucket of your soul in, that's actually worship. See what I'm saying? Most of us don't look at our longing for a guy, or our longing for a job, or our longing for success, or whatever, longing for a happy life. We don't look at that and go, oh, that's worship. And Jesus actually says, no, it is. So, number one, there's that connection to the well. Gabe, you put your finger on it earlier. This whole connection to the husband, she somehow, her heart is so longing for a relationship that she is willing to continue to get into really bad situations. And Jesus says, the solution to your bad situations is you actually need to start worshiping rightly. The Father is seeking people who worship Him in spirit and truth. In other words, you have got to start working spirit and truth. He talked to Nicodemus about spirit. Okay? And he gives some truth here. He's not like, hey, always get to God. He's like, no, the Jews are right, Samaritans are wrong. But something new is coming that's going to trump both of those things. And this is the key. He says, the Father is seeking. All right?
This reminds me, like, last week we were talking about how Nicodemus was receptive.
Yeah.
And that, like, some people might have been very freaked out. And there are people in the Bible that very obviously Jesus warns will reject them. Like, their hearts are hardened. They're going to be like, you know, you're a witch or you're this or that. That, like, she's receptive to him.
She is really receptive. Now,
I feel like most of us, if somebody were to like call us out on our shit like that, like we would get upset.
She's not receptive quite yet. We're going to get to the point where she really softens. Okay, and we'll talk about that. But you're right. She is fundamentally receptive. She is receptive in this passage in a way that the Jews are not. Okay? I'm going to read just a few notes. The Father is seeking. Listen. What's your view of God? Number one, do you see Him as seeking, or do you just see Him as kind of out there? Or do you see Him as pissed off? The difference in those views is everything. When you start to believe, first of all, that God is a father. Okay, now I know some of you have had lousy fathers. Okay, but I would say that all of us, even those of us who go, my father was lousy, the only way you can say you had a lousy father is if you had some idea of what a father should be. Okay? The idea of what a good father is. And Jesus is coming and saying, first and foremost, you need to see God as the ultimate Father, capital F. He is the kind of Father you've always longed for, and He is, get this guys, He's looking for you. Liz, I'm going to talk to you for just a second. As you think about Christianity, the most important thing to realize, like one of the most important epiphanies, is this idea that Christianity says God is a Father who is actually seeking you. And I'm not trying to call you out, but what I'm saying is, guys, this is so important. Because most of us look at like God's out there, and if I'm going to get there, I got to find my way to Him. If you start believing what Jesus says, that God is actually seeking you in this place where you are. She hadn't gone up to Jerusalem. She hadn't become a Jew. She wasn't doing any of the right stuff. Her own people, and He is seeking her. If you believe that, you will start looking at your life differently, and everything that happens, like when your dog dies, you don't actually go, woe is me, God must be trying to punish me. You're like, maybe God's trying to teach me something. I don't know what it is, but I know He's a Father, and I know if He cares about sparrows, then He sure as hell cares about my dog. Because my dog was a lot better than a sparrow. and what it does is all of a sudden I can start to deal with the ups and downs of life. I'm not just looking at it based on my circumstances. I'm going, where is God in my story? How is He trying to get through to me? How is He seeking me out? Psalm 56 says, He watches you as you toss in your sleep. He collects your tears and keeps them in a bottle. He journals about you. Writes it all down in His book. Psalm 119 says, before you were born, He had written the days that were formed for you. In other words, He's writing a story. When you start to think that that's who's looking out for you, you start to pay attention to what's happening in your life. Maybe this is the Father trying to get my attention and tell me something. when we ask that question about what are you hearing from God every Sunday, this is what we're presupposing. We're trying to encourage that you're paying attention, that God's seeking you. And Jesus says it right here. Now listen, because when you start moving through life in this way, seeing God as a Father who is in this world, seeking you out, it changes you. This woman starts thinking of God, of her fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God who made this world, sun, the moon, stars, all that are in it, that He has come down to this place, to the land of the cast-offs, to the cast-off among cast-offs, at high noon to meet me. Now, how many of us feel that way about the Father? Man, when you start to, it's going to change your life. I had a note. What the Father's looking, what does the Father's seeking look like? Jesus. Jesus walked into her life. Listen, Jesus walks into your life. He's walking in right now. Every single one of you are getting now you're not seeing Him in the flesh, in the person, but you're getting Him in the book, in the pages. And the question is, can you meet this Jesus? Do you want, now listen, it's going to change your life. Turn it upside down. Look at what happens at the end. This is going to go to the son who is hungry. I'm going to do this in 5 minutes. So you got a woman who is thirsty. She's wayward. A father who is seeking. There's a son who is hungry. I don't know if you noticed this. In other words, hunger and thirst is all through this passage. It's not just the woman. It starts with Jesus getting weary. Did you notice that right at the beginning? Jesus, wearied as He was from His journey. It's not that hard of a journey. The imagery is, remember we're talking about John, the creator of the universe has come down among us, and He's tired from a little journey. Yeah, He's tired. That's odd. The disciples go into town because what? They don't have any food. So everybody's probably hungry. A woman comes to the well and Jesus says, give me a drink. Now here's what's interesting. The disciples go into town to get food. The story kind of ends with the woman being transformed. Her reputation and her brokenness no longer defines her. And then the disciples come back right as all this is happening. She drops her water jar, super symbolic, runs back into town and says, come see the man who told me everything I've ever done. And like I said before, everybody's like, everything you've ever done?
We don't want to know.
We know a lot of it, and we've been using it to control you, and now you don't care. Okay, now listen, what has Jesus done for the woman? I'm going to tell you. He has seen her to the very core. All the way down. Good, bad, and ugly, and there's probably a whole lot of ugly. And He doesn't reject her. He basically says, Father cares for you. Father is seeking you. Even here, even without you changing anything. Okay, and what He does is He gives her a whole new reputation. What's her new reputation? Friend of Jesus. That's the woman who's like the friend of Jesus, met Him at the well.
She's not controllable anymore.
She's not controllable anymore. She's liberated.
That makes her a bit of a wild card to people.
She's a wild card. Okay, now listen. There's something really interesting in this passage. Jesus, this is the tail end. This is down in verse 31 through like 34. The disciples come back and they're like, oh, there's a woman. She runs back into town. They're like, Jesus, we got food. And Jesus goes, I have food. Jesus goes, I'm not hungry. I've been eating. They're like, what have you been eating? Did somebody bring you donuts? I don't know. And He's like, what He's saying here, I have food that you know nothing about. He's saying, my food is to do the will of the Father. What's the will of the Father? To seek people to worship Him. He's like, I've just fed my soul, helping this woman reconnect to God, giving her a brand new reputation, friend of Jesus. Now listen, does that make sense?
It sounds like man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God.
Yeah.
Like it's just
Man doesn't live by bread alone. Yep.
Food is from God.
Yep.
So-
Okay. So Jesus is saying, now listen, right there, you're like, oh, the woman was thirsty and she got her thirst satisfied. Jesus was hungry and he got his hunger satisfied. But listen, that's actually not the full picture. When you read it in context throughout the entire gospel, Jesus starts as the creator of the universe, John chapter 1. By the end of all of the gospels, Jesus is hanging on a cross and he's saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? I thirst. You actually see this great stripping, diminishing of Jesus. And what's really going, and you see this great ennobling of the woman. And the point is, what Christianity teaches is that this radical restoration of people does not come without a price. There is a cost. In other words, God doesn't just overlook sin and brokenness. He actually has to deal with sin and brokenness. And the way he deals with sin and brokenness is by bearing all the consequence of that himself. Jesus sucks up the poison of our falls. Jesus sucks up the sickness of the way we hurt each other and what we do to ours. Jesus takes all that on himself and he actually atones for sins. And so this picture, as you go through the Gospels, Jesus is losing his reputation. After Jesus becomes, she's a friend of Jesus, her reputation goes way up. Jesus' reputation starts to go down. And by the end of it, even his own disciples are running away from. Do you see what I'm saying? And all that to say, so here's what you've got. You have got a woman who is thirsty and a father who is seeking, and you have got a son who is hungry for that connection to happen, so much so that he's willing to go hungry, go thirsty, and lose everything himself. That's what you got to take away from this passage. So when you look at Nicodemus, you see somebody who's got everything going for him in the world, it looks like. No, he doesn't. He still needs God. And then you see this broken woman who has nothing going for her. And you go, oh my goodness, Jesus met her right where she was at, but he didn't leave her there. Her life is transformed. Her future is changed. She is not going to be the same going forward. I don't know how it all unpacked. I don't know what happens with the guy she was living with. We don't get that part of the story. But I'm confident of this. That woman followed Jesus from here on out because nobody had ever treated her the way he did.
I also see that it says like he's hungry, which of course like he got physically hungry as a human, but that like she misplaces her thirst.
Yeah.
And yet Jesus knows what he's actually hungry for.
Jesus has got the right hunger and the right. Jesus is so hungry and so thirsty for you and I to connect with the Father that he's willing to give up his place in heaven, put on flesh, like basically become a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. By his stripes we are healed, is Isaiah 53. Is that right? 53? Think so? Yeah. His hunger, his thirst is right placed. And as a result, even when he dies, God raises him up. Okay? I hope you never read this passage. I hope you never read it the same again. I hope you come back to this and go, oh my gosh. And when you feel poor and broken and downcast, you should come to this passage and treat it like a meal and just read it and think about these things because it's going to help you want to follow Jesus. Okay? Comforts my soul. Like I'm sitting here, lost a dog this morning. And a dog's not a person. They're still significant. We still care. And there's something about this passage that still gives me encouragement and hope, even in spite of sorrow and grief. And I don't really know how that works, but it does. And what I'm saying is this passage can do that in your life with your sorrow and your grief. Okay.